Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. This podcast overlaps with the online publication of the September edition of Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. Please have a read. It's free. It has a number of interesting articles, an update on C-3000 from me, an overview of Talisman Sabre, where the media were treated poorly, unfortunately, and an article about MQ-28 Ghostbat. I promised some thoughts in this podcast about why the decision in favour of the Mogami frigate for C-3000 wasn't taken 2 years ago, and why the government has chosen to run a sham competition, and we'll get to that. But first I want to do some big picture stuff because it's so much more important for the country, more important than individual acquisitions. And I'm going to say some unkind things about the US, not because I'm anti-American, but because I've been troubled for some time about the reliability of the US as an ally, and that reliability seems to be in further decline. Now, American democracy seems to be being dismantled in front of our eyes. I'm watching this pretty closely because of its security implications. I know that might sound a bit hyperbolic, but the process is actually underway. And I don't know if our policymakers are aware of what is happening because it has profound implications for our security. Now, I'm not going to go into the entire history of political extremism in the US, or maybe I should call it economic policy extremism, but certainly in the wake of the Great Depression, there was an upsurge of support for fascism, as was the case in many countries, not just Germany, Italy, and Japan, and all of Eastern Europe. Now, that has faded away, but in the US, it's never completely vanished from the edges of the political mainstream. There were some elements with Ronald Reagan and a stated aim of removing government from people's lives, while at the same time increasing the size of the government. And then a few years later, by Republican House leader Newt Gingrich and the so-called Republican Revolution, that was a very important factor in where we are today. It had elements such as attacking and demonizing Democrats as criminals and traitors and using the mechanism of unjustified legal investigations as a political tool, which partly explains the extreme polarization of US politics today. Now, this has also spilled over into areas such as judicial appointments, with many judges, including the Supreme Court, making decisions based on whether they were appointed by a Republican or a Democrat. This is inevitably going to bring us back to the Australian defence budget, pressure from the US to lift it. I believe this is something that needs to start now and not at some imaginary point in 2 or 3 years' time. There are a few elements of this, including the Elbridge Colby review into AUKUS, the results of which are expected to be known by late November. No one is expecting AUKUS Pillar 1 to be cancelled outright. There's just too much money to extract from Australia for that to happen. And that money is not only the gift that we're in the process of giving to US submarine building companies of $4.8 billion, but there's $7 billion worth of infrastructure at HMAS Sterling and $3 billion worth of assorted training services. So that's a handy $15 billion being spent to the direct benefit of the US even before the first submarine arrives. So who in their right mind would want that to stop? It's confused by the fact that, yes, in US political circles, there is this desire to make allies like Australia spend more. And I think that money is something like that is justified not because the US wants it, but we have to prepare for the eventuality that the US will no longer act as our security guarantor. I'm sort of going to interrupt this, it's very relevant, with a quick and very important public service announcement. Namely, this is Federal Parliament, the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties has commenced an inquiry into the nuclear-powered submarine partnership and a collaboration agreement between the Government of Australia and the Government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's to give it its full title. I've mentioned this before, signed in Geelong on the 26th of July. The committee invites interested individuals and organisations to make submissions addressing the treaty and its implications. However, I note that submissions are due by Tuesday, the 2nd of September. That date is only 1 week away, so I hope it isn't a complete sham. But in any case, why not have an inquiry into the US part of the equation? Why leave them out and focus only on the UK? Think about that for a moment, but I'll tell you why. Because the committee has a remit to examine treaties. So, do we have a treaty with the US? Well, obviously not. And no matter how often Defence Minister Richard Marles says we have a treaty-level agreement, as we've discussed before, there's no such thing. You either have a treaty or you don't. By the way, anyone interested in AUKUS and the UK part of the deal, please send in your submissions. Don't miss the opportunity. But getting back to the second-hand Virginia submarines for Australia, my own guess is that the US will permit the sale, and it's a sale, not a transfer, of 2 second-hand submarines to Australia, but it will only take place if Australia lifts defence spending to 3.5% of GDP. For people who have been following this for some time, as I've done my best to do, early draft legislation and discussion papers in the US made references to the submarines not detracting from Australia's other military capabilities, but their acquisition clearly is, and that problem is getting worse, not better. Hopefully I'll be able to elaborate on that in future podcasts. And I'll just briefly give the example of Canada. In the late 1980s, Canada had a pretty good crack at acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. That was going quite well until the US took the decision not to go ahead with the sale because they made the calculation that the Canadian defence budget was not big enough to handle the acquisition and support of nuclear-powered submarines, and that Canada was better off for their own interests and also in the broader interests of NATO, spending that money on other capabilities. I believe that people in the US are going to make a similar calculation when it comes to Australia and say either you've got to get serious about defence, or we're not going to sell the submarines, or we're going to delay them indefinitely, which will present a huge problem for the government. But let's talk a bit more about Ukraine. My previous podcast, I spoke a lot about how I feared that the summit between Trump and Putin would lead to nothing other than the further sellout of Ukraine. I think events are showing that my prediction is very sadly true. There are a few recent examples, probably the most significant being about long-range missiles called ATACMS that can be fired from HIMARS launchers. Ukraine has been supplied by some, but we have recently found out that the US has blocked their use for strikes within Russia in very much the same way that the Biden administration did, and which the Republicans were very critical about. Now, this policy of limiting the use of US weapons, guess who that's being run by? Any thoughts? Well, it turns out it's Elbridge Colby. Yes, the very same person conducting the AUKUS review. And I believe that the US has also blocked the use of British Storm Shadow cruise missiles because they have American components. It's possible that the French equivalent, the Scalp cruise missile, has been affected by the same thing. Now, I might be a bit dim, but I'm starting to see a disturbing pattern here. And class, what percentage of the ADF's guided weapons are manufactured by the US? Any ideas? Percentage between 0 and 100? Well, if you said 80%, you would be roughly correct. The US has recently announced what looks like a positive, approved the sale of a new ERAM missile, extended range TAC missiles, kind of the equivalent of Russian gliding bombs. But get this, once again, the use of those missiles may well be restricted by the US. So my interpretation of what's going on is that the Trump administration and this collection of, bureaucratic bootlickers that he's surrounded himself with, on the one hand, are taking actions where they can say to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians themselves, look, we're doing all of these things to help you, but at the same time, behind the scenes, they are doing as much as they can to undermine the effectiveness of these systems that they are selling. And they are selling them, not donating them. So again, no sanctions for Russia, no penalty is being applied to Russia, but it's always Ukraine being hit with more and more restrictions about what they can do. My theory, I have no doubt, that Donald Trump genuinely wants peace between Russia and Ukraine. He wants it so that he can win the Nobel Peace Prize, but he doesn't care how it's achieved. And if the simplest way is for Russia to defeat Ukraine, then that is the path that he is going to go down. And there's, again, further evidence. Just a few days ago, there was a Russian missile strike on a US-owned factory in Kiev. From the Trump administration, a collective shrug. Nothing at all. And it completely undercuts the logic of Ukraine's rare earth minerals deal, which was meant to be, well, once US companies are a part of the fabric of the Ukraine economy, the Russians will not dare attack them. That's obviously not the case. And our policy makers here in Australia should keep the same thing in mind. If anyone is still contemplating something similar, some handover to the US of Australian rare earths in exchange for some sort of security promises or the hope that this will do us any good, it won't. It's meaningless. Don't do it in the first place. There have been further purges in the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has removed Lieutenant General Jeffrey Krause, who led the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's out. Presumably because the sin of General Krause, no one knows for sure, but it might have been because his assessment of the US airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities were not as positive as that of Donald Trump, who of course claimed that the facilities had been totally obliterated. Two others who got the chop were the head of the US Naval Reserve and the head of Naval Special Warfare Command. And these sorts of policy positions that senior people have to adopt, or the things that they say even more basically, such as having to say that the 2020 US presidential election was stolen, these have become the sort of litmus test for whether or not you're going to keep your job in the US. This means that our closest ally, the country that we're still far too dependent on, is in the process of getting rid of competent, qualified people and replacing them with ideologues. Now, that doesn't fill me with a lot of hope for the future of our relationship with them. Part of a pattern. A couple of weeks earlier, the head of the Bureau of Labour Statistics, a completely civil agency, supposedly at arm's length from government, the head of that, Eric McEntaffer, was fired instantly because she was in charge of the agency. It released revised job figures that showed a picture of an economy that's starting to struggle rather than an economy that is booming, completely contradicting the established Trump narrative. So she was out. And the US economy is slowing for a number of things, including the impact of tariffs. Australia is part of that as well, despite, being a close ally. Russia is not. And, the roundup in the United States and expulsions of many workers from industries such as agriculture. In the remaining time, I did promise a few further words about C-3000. Again, I refer you to the article that will be online within a few hours of you listening to this, speculating about why the Mogami was not selected 2 years ago. it might turn around the kind of original question of having an in-service design, which was one of the fundamental requirements of this deeply flawed goat rodeo process, which has got us to the place where we are now. None of which, by the way, detracts from the Mogami. I will say again, excellent ship, a lot of promise. My criticism is not at all of Japan or the Japanese ship. It is about how we got to here in terms of the Australian process. Now, if the rules of the acquisition had been followed 2 years ago, the Mogami that would have been selected then, the in-service design, had no vertical launch missile cells at all. That's correct. That's just a fact, though they were planned to be retrofitted with 16 cells, and that's a process that has now started. However, by delaying the selection until now, the upgraded Mogami is under contract, and it is now the only possible choice for the RAN because Japan is in the process of switching construction from the original model to the new one. That means you can no longer order an original Mogami because from a supply chain point of view, the only practical choice is the new upgraded version. The upgraded version has 32 VLS cells rather than 16. It is 10% larger. It has a different radar mast and greater power generation capability. So a more powerful ship than the original one, by quite a way. I can understand why it's the more attractive option for the RAN, and it does, as I say, unfortunately, explain potentially why it wasn't chosen 2 years ago when it wasn't under contract. Now, another hint that the outcome was predetermined that has always bothered me, as regular listeners know, is why the Saab 9LV combat management system was never mandated, even though it's on all of the other RAN surface ships and will be part of the future Hunters and the upgraded air warfare destroyers. The official excuse was, well, there isn't time to do it, but that is demonstrable rubbish. ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems offered to do it as part of their unsuccessful bid, as did at least 2 of the unsuccessful bidders. Remember, all of this is secret. I'm not meant to know this, but I'm pretty sure that the 2 Korean bidders, Hyundai and Hanwha Ocean, either offered 9LV as part of their baseline solutions or as part of an enhanced offer for Australia. So why, then, was the 9LV blocked when there was plenty of time to exclude it? The real reason might be, think about this for a moment, that Japan had no particular interest in offering 9LV. They have their own, undoubtedly, good combat system. They looked at this minimum change philosophy and went, well, we're just going to focus on doing what we know best, and sorry, if we have to offer 9LV, then we will decline to do so. If Japan had formally declined to do so, that would have represented something like a major area of non-compliance in their approach. So there you go. That could be another part of the equation. I would like to think that I'm wrong, but I don't think so, as more and more evidence accumulates. And finally, why does this matter? Well, I think that having evaluation processes and acquisition processes with integrity counts, because very simply, without that, Australia is in danger of losing our reputation as providing a level field for companies wishing to win business here. If companies presume that there's a huge amount of sovereign risk chasing work in Australia, well, they just won't do so. Now, that might suit all of the people in defence who just want to continue buying things from the FMS catalogue, but it is unarguably not in Australia's best national interest. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.